If you watch a lot of spooky channels on YouTube, then you may have heard of a few time travel stories before, one of the most famous being the man from Taured. This isn't a story I'm going to cover here since it's well known and has been debunked. It was based on a true story of a Japanese man who was arrested for using a false passport from a non-existent country. The tale I'm going to tell you today is one I haven't seen in any other video and is taken from Jenny Randles' fascinating book Time Storms. Similar to the story of the man from Taured, this is the account of another lost soul who appears to be stranded out of time. Randles lists this case as being from research conducted by a gentleman called Ron Edwards for Fate magazine in March 1997. However, I've come across a far more detailed analysis than Randles' account, which seems to show that this story is in fact true. It also contains a wealth of information that isn't contained in Randles' book, and even has photos of the man himself from the New York Daily News. The information in this video is taken from both Randles' book and this article. I've posted the link to the article in the description if you'd like to read more on this baffling case. Now, without further ado, let's meet the man who came from nowhere. Boston, United States, the 11th of February 1945. The night shift is already in full swing at the US Public Health Service hospital when an ambulance pulls up to the entrance. It doesn't look like any ambulance anyone has seen before, being a blue van with no wording or identification on the side. The driver, dressed in what appeared to be a high-ranking naval uniform, exited the vehicle and wheeled a trolley into the foyer. "You will call this man Charles Jamison," said the driver. He either could not or would not say anything else. He then got back into the ambulance and left, never to be seen or heard from again. It was clear to the nurses on duty that night that Charles Jamison was in a very bad way. He was around 60 years old, 6 foot tall, and weighed 200 pounds or 14 stone. He was at this point unconscious, and they weren't certain he would survive. He had osteomyelitis, which is a bone marrow infection. He also had hideous sores all over his body, and his back was scarred with what appeared to be shrapnel wounds. There was a 2-inch scar on his right cheek, the index finger of his left hand was missing, and both arms were covered in fading tattoos. These were a mixture of flags and hearts, the flags being both British and American. One tattoo had a scroll which seemed to say US Navy. The fact that he'd been brought to the only hospital in Boston that treated seamen was telling. They thought that this could be a big clue. However, after being sent Jamison's fingerprints, both the FBI and the military reported that they had no record of him. His photograph was sent to missing persons organizations across the country, but this also failed to turn up anything. The British authorities also had no record of Charles Jamison either. Jamison himself couldn't help. He was in a coma. After several weeks of treatment, his condition became stable. However, the infection had left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down, and his speech was so impaired it was very difficult to understand what he was saying. He also couldn't remember who he was or what had happened to him. However, in the summer of 1947, Jamison startled a nurse when he suddenly sat up and said in a noticeable, quote, British accent, "I simply do not know," as if replying to a question. His doctor, Oliver Williams, and a British naval expert worked with him to try to gently coax some answers out of him. Jamison said that he had served on the HMS Bellerophon in the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and that he'd also sailed on the Cutty Sark. But he had no recall of any events after that. A whole quarter of a century was missing. Then things took an even stranger turn. The name Charles William Jamison had been found on the manifest of a US Navy transport ship called the USS Luzerne. It stated that the ship had docked in Boston on the 9th of February 1945, just 2 days before the mysterious man had been dropped off at the hospital. But the strangest part about the manifest was that all the information on Charles Jamison had been written in ink into a typed document, as if it had been added at a later date. The former captain had no explanation for this, and also had no recall of Jamison. The notes explained that Jamison had been born in Boston on the 17th of July, 1895, and that he'd spent 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp before being found inexplicably adrift off the Irish coast. This was during the Luzern's 16-day voyage from Southampton to Boston, repatriating injured troops. However, there was no record of a Charles William Jamison being born in Boston on the 17th of July, 1895. No one by that name had been made a naturalized citizen. No one connected to the ship had heard of him or could explain the handwritten notes. A final twist comes from Lloyd's Shipping Registry in London. Amongst their records was a report from a German U-24 submarine that had sunk a wooden ship which fired on them from the North Sea on the 10th of July 1941. This ship was clearly identified by the name the Cutty Sark. They saw it sink beneath the waves under the barrage of fire from the U-boat and rescued just one survivor, Charles William Jamison, who spent the next 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp in Belgium before being liberated in early 1945. There is, however, a big problem with these notes from Lloyd's Shipping. Bear in mind that Lloyd's is, among other things, a maritime classification society founded in 1760, who would have nothing to gain by falsifying documents or spinning tales for publicity. So it makes the final twist in the tale even more baffling. What happened to the Cutty Sark, according to the notes in Lloyd's Shipping, never actually happened in real life. The Cutty Sark was never sunk by a German U-boat. In July 1941, the wooden vessel was berthed in London and is still there to this day. For the last 20 years of his life, Jamison didn't say another word. He collapsed into a catatonic state and passed away in January 1975. He was buried with full naval honours in a coffin draped with both the British and American flags. So who was Charles Jamison? He was most certainly a real person. This is backed up by solid evidence. And he almost certainly was a sailor. He recognised pictures of vessels and was able to name them. That and the fact his name appeared in the manifesto stating he had been on a ship which had been torpedoed, namely the Cutty Sark, also lends weight to this. But what are we to make of the mystery of the fact that all these notes were added later? What about the fact the Cutty Sark never sank, despite the note in Lloyd's also stating that it did? Could it be possible that Jamison was from another dimension, one slightly different from ours, in which these things did happen? Had the ambulance driver been the same man who added the notes in the ship manifest, almost as if rewriting history to make it seem as if Jamison belonged here? And his poor health condition, could it be due, in part at least, to travelling from one dimension to another? That he'd sat up as if answering a question with the words, "I simply do not know," sounds very similar to other cases where people have gone missing and been returned in a trance-like state, repeating phrases over and over. But perhaps the most frightening thought is this. When people go missing in strange circumstances in this world, could it be that they enter an alternate dimension? What if people don't just disappear, but instead somehow enter a portal to another world? If so, could Charles Jamison's family still be out there, looking for him from the world where he came from, not knowing he's never coming back? It is, to put it mildly, a rather frightening thought.